Welcome to the 21st episode of Certain Group's podcast, Alternative Litigation Strategies, where I interview legal leaders from companies and law firms on the latest litigation and settlement trends and strategies that are currently impacting the world of class action litigation. Today, we have a very timely topic that I know is top of mind of almost every in-house attorney and class action defense attorney that I've spoken with in recent months, which is how do you tackle this new phenomenon of fraud that we're seeing in class action settlement administration? I'm your host, Kevin Skrzysowski. I'm a director with the litigation consulting firm Certain Group, where we, among other things, specialize in working with businesses to mitigate, cap, and transfer the risk in class action settlements. And today, I'm pleased to be joined by Jim Prutsman, a senior director at Kroll Settlement Administration. Jim, thank you for joining me on the program this morning.
Thank you for having me, Kevin.
So, Jim, now you have more than 25 years of experience in class action settlement administration, and I know that you've administered some of the highest profile class action settlements in the United States. If I were to say to you that claims administration in class action lawsuits is currently threatened by more risks and the potential for more fraud than ever before, would that be an accurate statement?
I would absolutely agree with that statement, Kevin. We have seen, this is a relatively recent phenomenon. I would say that in all the years that I've been working in the administration business, that there's always been a certain amount of, let's call it fraud, waste, and abuse over the years. But really within the last 18 months or thereabouts, Kevin, we've seen a tremendous uptick in the number of claim filing, by and large, the majority of it being fraudulent, wasteful claims.
Okay, so give me an overview of the landscape of the waste, fraud, and abuse that is currently impacting claims administration today. And in particular, what are these new things that you said you've been seeing them for 18 months? I think we've been seeing them for the past 12. Mm-hmm. And as I've been going on to meetings with lawyers and in-house counsel, I'm now hearing about these things on a daily basis. What are these new phenomena that we're seeing?
Yeah, I would say that just to be kind of clear here, I think that if you look at, there's many different types of settlements. As you know, there's what we would call a closed class, and that's where you have a known list of individuals that are impacted by a particular issue. And then you have open classes, which are largely consumer-based cases where maybe they purchase a product. There are certain allegations about that product and maybe the way it was sold or marketed or packaged. And it's uncertain as to who exactly bought these products. So I would say that for the most part, and there's certainly been some exceptions to this, and we can kind of cover some of those elements of when it happens to a closed class. But I would say by and large, the overwhelming case type where we're seeing the type of abuse and fraud, rampant fraud that you're referring to, Kevin, has been largely on the open classes where it's an unknown class. And, look, we're not necessarily spending our days worried about the person, the single person who's out there filing a claim, a case where they didn't buy the product. Does that exist? Without question. Is that something that we're going to spend a huge amount of time and resources on? Absolutely not. What we're more concerned about is organized crime. We're concerned about bad actors that are filing tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of claims on an individual case. And when you look at it and you say, well, this remedy is just not that large, it's a single digit type of remedy. Well, as soon as somebody's filing 300,000 claims, even if it's $1 remedy, well, it becomes quite interesting and there's an awful lot of motivation for them on something like that. So we're seeing it. Certainly, our analysis tells us that some of it is onshore based. I would say that the largest section increase fraudulent claims has come from overseas. We're seeing some that is Eastern Europe based. We're seeing claims that are based in Asia, just really kind of all over the board, Kevin. So I think it's an eyes wide open moment for us in terms of looking at the landscape and trying to determine what's going on and where this is coming from.
And I think that's very interesting. And that's where we're seeing it as well. It's mostly what I would say falls under the realm of consumer class actions, food and beverage products, consumer packaged goods, where there's a publication notice campaign, but sometimes it's coming in even when there's a direct notice as well.
Yes.
And mostly normally when there's a settlement, if it's a consumer class action, it almost always just covers U.S. residents. So I think what's daunting is when you're starting to see it come in from potential foreign agents. Let's start there, because I think, to your point, that's where some of the biggest risk is. Who are these foreign agents, and what are you seeing? Are these foreign domain addresses? Are there foreign IP addresses? What are these things called bots, and how are they contributing to the problem?
Yeah, I would say that you've hit on an interesting segment here, and that is the bot fraud claims. We're seeing very clear indications that these claims are being filed programmatically. Don't think of somebody sitting there like a keyboard warrior typing in claim after claim. There's certainly elements of that, has been in the past, but the largest growth sector that we've seen has been bot fraudulent claims. So certainly IP source or registration is an element that we look at, Kevin. Mm-hmm. But I'll tell you that having met with our standing fraud, waste, and abuse team meeting, we're looking at 35 different elements of a claim and analyzing that several different ways and determining, does this have indicia of bot filed claim? We're checking everything from the data that's being input to where the traffic's coming from to what's being put into claims, timing of claims, location of claims. I mean, I think that one of the first cases that really tipped us off as to what was going on was, it was a consumer product. It was a labeling issue. It wasn't a product that was widely sold. And we had conversations with the client, and they're like, we have claims now for more product than was actually sold. And that certainly was a early indication to us that something was amiss and caused us to begin this deeper dive on claims analysis. And look, I don't think our work is done here. I don't think it'll ever be done, Kevin. And it's a constant game of cat and mouse, and they improve their techniques on how they're building bots or filing claims. And we're constantly improving our techniques to try and identify the fraud, waste, and abuse.
I just think that's incredible. So, I mean, and I've heard of these as well. I think we had one where literally more claims come in than units shipped when you check them against the actual business records and you verify them.
That's absolutely right, Kevin. And something that I mentioned earlier is that this can even happen while we're kind of focused here in this conversation on consumer products or open classes. We see the same thing in a closed class where there's been a negotiation between the parties, and whilst the class is known and we're sending out notice and we're giving them unique IDs to file their claims, that ultimately the parties negotiate that to make it easier for people to file claims, they aren't required to use a class member ID, or there can be some lowering of the bar, if you will, of filing these claims. And we're seeing the same thing where it's a known class of a few thousand people. And the next thing you know, we're staring down the gun barrel of hundreds of thousands of claims. And I think that can be a well-intentioned approach to the claims filing. There's unintended consequences to that downstream, nonetheless of which is the overall cost of administration and time of administration.
Right. That's right. And I want to focus on the closed classes, but let's go back to something you mentioned about the open classes. And you mentioned these potential foreign actors. You mentioned timing and you mentioned location. So how can you tell if it's potential fraud? I mean, are you looking at domains? Are there emails coming in from non-commercial providers? Are there hundreds of thousands of hits from the same IP address? What are the indicators that this is fraudulent?
Yeah, as I mentioned, Kevin, it's all of the above. Again, looking at about 35 different data elements that we're triangulating on. So it's everything from IP source to fingerprint analysis, if you will, digital fingerprint analysis to try and determine where is this coming from. Again, looking at the data that's being utilized, we see what I would call, look, these people are smart. They're very smart. We're looking at the claims that are coming in. We're looking at the data associated with those claims. And when you do a deep dive on addresses, as an example, you'll start to see things that don't make sense. So address analysis becomes very important. So things like we'll see New Boston, Kansas. Well, with a quick Google search, you start to understand there is no place that is New Boston, Kansas. So they're using some sort of database dictionary in terms of completing the claimant information. So we're looking at things like that. So it's a robust analysis that we do. And we always try, and a lot of these cases have pretty short timelines, right, for us to do our work. So we're always cognizant of making sure that we stick the landing with regard to court-ordered dates. But it's a big lift. And again, every time that we identify a new vector or we develop new technology to identify the fraud, waste, and abuse, it's another cycle. We've got to run through the data again to ensure that we have done the best job that we can at that time to identify the fraud, waste, and abuse.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, 35 factors, that's a robust checklist that you go through to determine, what is waste, fraud, and abuse versus what is a legitimate claim, so that you can actually accomplish the overall goal that all parties in the court wants, which is to get the payments in the hands of the class members, right? That's the objective.
Absolutely, Kevin. And I think that people get a misperception of our job and how we treat our job. Our goal is, and always has been, pay legitimate claims, make it as easy as possible for legitimate claimants to receive the relief that they're entitled to under the terms of the settlement.
Right.
But our job is also, conversely, to identify fraud, waste, and abuse to the best that we can. So we take that job very seriously. And look, we don't try and tip the scales one way or another. We try and take a comprehensive, independent, neutral analysis of the claims. And ultimately, the determination is the determination.
Absolutely. And it sounds like the real issue, and what we really need to vet out, is what's filed by a person versus what's programmatically filed. I mean, that's where the massive fraud comes in. I think you had mentioned you've seen hundreds of thousands of claims come in that were from a potentially fraudulent source. I think we had one recently, and there was a de minimis without proof benefit, $5.
Yeah.
And there were 35, I want to say it was something like 35,000 claims came in one day.
Yeah.
And looked at the IP address, and I believe the IP address was traced back to China.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that really adds up. So I think, in terms of like timing and location and all the tactics that folks employ programmatically. I mean, I've even heard that there's things like you can look at domains and you can see when domains are creating email addresses, and you can see these massive amounts of email addresses that are sometimes created just days after the settlement website is launched that are coming in commercial email addresses.
I think you've hit on something that we look at from a very broad perspective. And I think the overarching term is velocity, Kevin. We're tracking along at a certain claim rate, and all of a sudden the velocity of claims just blows through the roof and occurs for a period of time. And what's very interesting to us is that maybe it's a resource limitation on the bad actors' side. Perhaps it's traffic monitoring wherever these are being sourced. Perhaps they're just trying not to exhaust it. Maybe it's a programming error, but we see these massive bow waves, a tidal wave of claims that all of a sudden the velocity of the claims just shoots through the roof. And then strangely, for no reason, the claims volume drops off. So again, their computer stalled out. Is it their internet service provider has shut them down? Are they turning their attention to the next claim? There's a lot of intrigue around when this happens, why this happens. But certainly, I will tell you that a massive change in velocity is one of our early indicators to take a second look at the case and what's transpiring here.
So, how many cases are you seeing this in where there could be a programmatic influx of potentially fraudulent claims? Because as I went around and had meetings with in-house lawyers and class action defense practitioners and did the conference circuit at the beginning of the year, I was telling folks some of these stories, and people were in shock and awe when they were hearing it. And as the years progressed, I'm hearing it more and more. And I'm at the point now where almost every time I sit down across the table from an in-house, AGC of litigation or a partner at a Ann Lowe & Hundred law firm, they're telling me a personal story about how it's happened. Yeah. So how pervasive is this right now in administration?
I think it's extremely pervasive, Kevin, and I see it increasing. I will not represent that every consumer case that we administer has this issue. And there's steps that we can take on our end to try and mitigate some of it. But I will tell you that by and large, cases where there's a no proof claim element, we're getting to the point to your earlier remark where it can be a low dollar recovery.
Well, we've seen it with just $5.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Kevin. So I would say that it's something that we are on the alert for on every single one of our cases, open or closed class. We're looking at it. And I will tell you that, again, the propensity of this happening has escalated through that, let's call it 18-month cycle. Again, not every case, but certainly the majority of cases we're seeing some elements of fraud, waste, and abuse.
That is really shocking. And again, we're talking about the programmatic fraud, both US based and overseas, that are impacting this. You had mentioned something I thought was just very important called velocity. You see the velocity impact, and the velocity ramps up, and then all of a sudden it's gone because maybe that program or those agents behind that program decided there's a new settlement on the block, and let's move on to the next one. We may have better chances, which leads me into promotion websites or feeder websites. I mean, I've seen these sort of proliferate recently as well. I'm registered for most of them just so I can keep track. I registered for more and more new ones this year that I've seen. How do these promotion or these feeder websites fit into the equation? And are they contributing to the potential for waste, fraud, and abuse as well?
Yeah, I think that they've always, I'm not going to say always, the feeder or promotional websites, to me, relatively new phenomena, having done this for as long as I have. We didn't always have them.
Sure.
So there's always been an element that is kind of annoying where I do the same thing that you do, Kevin. I sign up for them and track them and watch them and see what people are saying. And, you see the traffic of, oh, here's another one. No proof required. Everybody file your claim. And you're like, was there any discussion of, did anybody actually purchase this product and fall into the parameters of what the settlement's about? Certainly that's been there since the promotion sites have grown as large as they have. And we've seen a growth of subscriptions. We've seen a growth in the number of these types of sites out there. I think that what we're concerned about is that clearly the bad actors are aware of these sites as well, and whether they're using it as the alarm clock to signal them that here's an opportunity to point the bot towards or this type of thing. Feels that way. Do I have empirical evidence that says that? I do not, but I will tell you that any time that any of the promotional sites or feeder sites promotes a settlement, we see an uptick in claims. And then in terms of velocity, around that time, shortly thereafter, do we start to see bots? Sometimes. Sometimes it's earlier. Sometimes it's later. I'm not going to say it's a one-to-one. I'm not going to say it's the trigger point, but there definitely seems to be some corollary activity between a widely promoted settlement and when we see bot fraud activity. There's no question.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think, we're seeing the same thing and working with you on some cases. I think it's.
And look, I don't mean to besmirch the promoter sites and feeder sites. I think that a lot of them, the majority of them will say, do not file a claim unless you are in fact
a
legitimate class member. I think they're trying to do the right thing. The reality is that we put a lot of words on a web page. You just wonder how many of them get digested.
But I think the point is that the bad actors that are behind these programs have they have an endless bag of tactics and tricks that they're willing to leverage. And any degree of success sort of leads to replication. And if you reward bad behavior, it just leads to more bad behavior because the bad actors like to double down. And if they can leverage technology like feeds and alerts at their disposal to point those bots in the direction, it certainly does look like they have done so and they're doing so.
I think that's right, Kevin. I think that you've hit on something here as to why are we seeing this proliferation of bot attack and fraudulent filed claims and programmatically filed claims? Clearly, they've had success somewhere.
Mhm.
We look at our own house and we feel like we've done a good job of keeping the house clean, but clearly they have been paid somewhere. Otherwise, there's just simply no motivation that would exist for doing so unless they just have too much time and resources on their hands, which I have a difficult time wrapping my mind around that.
Yeah, it definitely is a cat and mouse game, and it's one in which the controls to try to protect against it seem to be it's a constant evolution that will continue to change, and who knows what we're even going to see next on some of these. Jim, I want to try to wrap up. We're kind of getting close to the time limit, and I know you've given a lot of examples of how Kroll attempts to limit waste, fraud, and abuse, and I certainly don't want you to give away any of your secret sauce, but just for the audience, that's listening, in terms of this conversation around programmatic attacks on settlements and fraudulent claims and bots and fake domains and fraudulent IP addresses and foreign IP addresses. I mean, just what are some safeguards that people can employ? What are some things they should look for to protect against the waste, fraud, and abuse to ensure that the overall goal of getting payments into the hands of the actual class members is achieved?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Kevin. I think that the first thing that I'd recommend, and I think every administrator out there is probably saying the same thing, but I'd really encourage people to consult with us early and allow us to work together to identify where we can put guardrails in place. Again, we're not interested in suppressing the claims rate. What we are interested in doing is, as I mentioned earlier, having the tools at our disposal to identify valid claims and to identify invalid claims. So first off, early discussions, early consultation. I think the other is you have to find a trusted partner, somebody that you can give the authority to identify the fraud, waste, and abuse and trust that they have the tools necessary, the background necessary, the resources necessary to adequately identify the fraud, waste, and abuse. And it's no small undertaking. It really is not. So I think you need to look at what resources does your administrator have to bring to bear to these types of things, both from a staffing perspective, from an experience perspective, from a technology perspective. Subsequent to that, I think that it's important to have required data elements when appropriate. I think that there's certain data elements that I would really recommend that specifically we're talking about online claims here for the most part, Kevin, not that we don't see fraudulent paper claims, but largely where we're seeing the abuse when we're talking about bots is electronic claims. So having a verified email address that we can utilize for a lot of different reasons. Part of it is for claims analysis, but a part of it is also rightfully so if there needs to be some sort of follow-up, Kevin. There's a defect with the claim with a legitimate class member and we need to contact them and ask for additional details, or they missed a step in the claim process and we want to give them an opportunity to cure that appropriately. It's a heck of a lot more efficient, Kevin, to do that electronically via email than us to rely on a ever challenged postal system, plus the protracted timelines associated with doing so. So there's good reasons to require fields that email address, a name, an address fields are key, and these types of things. So I think that what's being required to file a claim, those data elements that we're capturing all become critical components to our success, our ability to identify fraud, waste, and abuse.
Yeah, I think those are all very critical factors to consider that you've identified. Definitely planning and prevention at the earliest of stages can prevent a lot of the waste, fraud, and abuse that we're seeing on the back end. And last but not least, there are some products on the market, such as class action settlement insurance, that businesses can leverage to transfer all of the financial risk to a third-party carrier in those types of situations as well. But no, great insights, valuable information that you shared with us today, Jim. This is a really interesting discussion, very timely, and I think there's going to be a lot of listeners across the legal marketplace because people are asking me about these issues really on a daily basis. So thank you so much for joining us today. It was a real pleasure to have you as my guest. I just, again, want to thank you for all of your time and all of the valuable insights that you shared with us.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. I appreciate you having me. And if anybody has anything that they'd like to get some thoughts on, happy to help. I can be reached via email, Kevin, at james.prutsman@kroll.com. And look forward to speaking with you further about this and the continuing landscape and keeping our eye on the prize.
And we definitely will as it continues to evolve. So thanks again, Jim. And of course, as always, I'd like to thank our audience for listening. If you'd like to hear more, please be sure to follow us on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or anywhere you listen to your favorite podcasts. If you'd like to listen to a recording of today's program or would like to learn more about the litigation and risk transfer solutions that Certum Group provides, you can always reach out to me directly at kevins@certumgroup.com, or you can go directly to our website for more information at www.certumgroup.com. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and until next time.